The Alliance Defense Fund said these crosses represent a choice by the family of the deceased. And if the family of the deceased was Jewish and they wanted a Star of David, the Highway Patrol Association would put up the Star of David because they were religious, representing the faith of the trooper. And the state of Utah said, wait a minute. And so that was noted by the 10th Circuit. Because if in fact it is religious, that strengthens our argument. And it was like, wait a minute, the state of Utah and Highway Patrol Association, aren't you reading the same playbook? And they ended, and I just sat there and said, great, I'll watch this cat fight because it helped our position. And so what the Highway Patrol Association said was the families chose the cross, and they would have a choice of that symbol. And yes, it did reflect the religious beliefs of the family. So, but the state of Utah said, no, you can't do that. Because the state of Utah knew as soon as they acknowledged that it was a religious symbol, it strengthened my case.
Thank you, Elias Defense Fund, for sticking your foot in it.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So kind of out of curiosity, because I grew up with a lot of cops around and they've talked about this before. A lot of them have said, well, what if they all just elected their different religion, like, not that they had different religions, but if they said, if the Jewish cop, the one in the state, elected to have a Star of David, then could that be put on government grounds because he chose personally to have that up? Or would it, does that make sense? Like, if the individual cops actually chose before they passed to put, that they say, yes, on my graveside I would like a religious symbol, would that still be, does that make sense?
Well, I don't want to step on you, but keep in mind, this is not their grave site. This is where they died. Their grave is entirely separate.
Well, it's not even where they died.
Right, and it's not where they died necessarily, too. That's their point.
It's just where they're being memorial.
Well, if they die in the middle of the road, they kept a cross there, you can hit it.
Only in Alabama.
And the answer is no. Based upon what the state of Utah says, they're putting up a memorial. And so the memorial should not, based upon what the state's position is, the memorial shouldn't reflect religious beliefs, but it should be a memorial.
So it should be to the serving service of the truth rather than his religious practice.
Right, and it should be uniform.
That makes sense.
It should be uniform rather than based upon individual choices. And the other thing that Wimmer was saying today, is, well, look, we have religious memorials in cemeteries. We have crosses in cemeteries, government-owned cemeteries. That analysis doesn't apply because we're not talking about cemeteries. We're talking about the front lawn of government building. We're talking about the right-of-way, the borrow pit next to government highways. And the analysis doesn't apply that you have in cemeteries because by tradition, by culture, even if it's a government-owned cemetery, we've accepted the fact that people put up religious memorials in cemeteries. So if these crosses had been in cemeteries, we would not have had the basis for any kind of a lawsuit.
But don't the private people almost burial plots inside the cemetery? The families own those burial.
They own them or they lease them. But yeah, so and that the analysis is much different than what we have in this situation. Yes, sir.
Would you care to speculate why it took the Supreme Court 4 times to revisit this? It made me rather nervous.
No, my best guess is because Justice Clarence Thomas was writing his 19-page dissenting opinion. they took a vote, and they didn't have the 4 votes to grant cert, and he said, well, let's hold off, tried to convince other people to vote with him, nobody did. He said, I
But
want
do
to
you,
vote.
do you know that, actually? Do
Say
you have
again?
any sense of whether it was 8-1
Oh,
or?
no, we'll never know. They don't release any of that at all, and it's only because he wrote a dissenting opinion that we know that he would have granted cert. So we don't know that the vote was 8-1. There may have been some others. We know there, and it.
But nobody joined him on that.
Right, nobody joined him on that. There's 9 justices. You only need 4 to grant cert. So we know there wasn't 4. We know that there was 1, and somewhere in between. Where it was.
You've spoken a little bit to this already in terms of generalities of why in cemeteries it's okay, here it's not. But using what I would think is a reasonable person to me, I look at other, what I would consider entanglements. So on our dollar bills, we have In God We Trust. This is pretty clear endorsement as far as my subjective reaction. So in a larger sense, what principles are being used here? To allow, for example, In God We Trust to be.
But in God we trust is being
and to be our motto. I understand that.
but that's being challenged as well.
Not
They just
Not
reaffirmed
successfully,
in
but
God
it is
we
being
trust.
We're framing the practice.
Is a magical phrase that protects our dollar bills from turning into Soviet agents.
Right.
well. All right, and I mean, Congress just renewed the In God We Trust as a national motto. You know, it depends on, I guess it depends on the level of the offense before the courts will weigh in on something like that. And there's what's called ceremonial deism, that the courts kind of say, we don't really care about In God We Trust on the back of the dollar bill. It's not that troublesome. They don't blatantly say that, but I think that's what goes on in
So the thought that I've had is, if our dollar bill said, we don't trust in God, people would know.
Right, but
That's also a religious token because we're saying we don't trust in something that doesn't. Instead of saying we trust in something.
right, and what you just suggested is the argument that you make, but we all know, well, that's the argument that you make, and that's why the First Amendment was enacted, to protect against that kind of problem. But the courts aren't going to get exorcised about that, and the courts aren't going to do it.
So does that fall under the lemon test category?
Well, it does, but the courts have essentially said they aren't going to weigh in on it, and they're not going to do anything about it. And it's been litigated time and time again. And yeah, it's wrong, but the courts have essentially said, go ahead.
So it could be possible that, like my friend was saying, that the Supreme Court didn't take up the case of the crosses simply because that would be a whole can of worms for the lemon test that could cause a bunch of other rippling problems for the entire country.
The lemon test is not very good. We know that. But was this case the correct vehicle to use? And obviously Clarence Thomas thought so. Nobody else thought so. I don't think it was a good one because there were so many factual problems with this case. And we hadn't argued in the trial court or before the 10th Circuit, we hadn't argued, let's throw out the lemon test. That was something that was new when we got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, the majority of the justices on the Supreme Court have said, we don't like the lemon test. But nobody's come up with a better one. And Justice Thomas says, I don't like the lemon test. I think that federal government shouldn't be regulating religion, and it should be up to the states. And let's throw out the lemon test, and let's let the states regulate religion. So, yes, sir.
What are the chances of the World Trade Center cross the world?
Right.
You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Is that still active? And if so, what do you think are the chances
Yeah.
of that?
Just a background on that. American Atheists filed a lawsuit dealing with what's called the World Trade Center cross. When the Trade Center was bombed and fell down, some people found I-beams that were supposedly in the shape of a Roman cross, and it became an icon. Yeah. And so now they're building a museum underneath the World Trade Center Memorial, and American Atheists filed a lawsuit challenging that cross and the display of that cross. There's some problems with that because that museum is privately owned, and although it's on government land, the museum is leased by private people. The museum is privately owned. And again, as we talked earlier, the First Amendment only governs government action. And so if somebody gives this icon and says, here, display this, and it's a private icon displayed in a private museum that's privately owned and operated, the fact that they're leasing the land or the space from the government doesn't rise to the level of a First Amendment violation. Now, I don't know the facts of it, but based upon the limited information I have, there may not be a First Amendment violation unless you can tie it into government action, because only the government can violate the First Amendment. So, but yeah, that lawsuit was filed, I think June or July of this year. And it was filed, an amended complaint was filed. I don't know exactly what the status is, but I have some concerns because you've got to show government action in order to establish a violation of the First Amendment.